Hey there, it's me Priyam and today I'm going to show you how you can build this 5-inch freestyle cinematic FPV quad. So let's start the build, but before showing the build process I'm going to show you some freestyle moves, so let's start it. Alright, here are all the components I am using for this build. For the frame, it's the Geprc Vapor D5. It's a dead cat frame and it provides a floaty movement while flying. And this time for the stack, I am using Diatone Mamba. It comes with a F405 flight controller and a 55 amps ESC. And for motors, I am using the T-Motor F60 1950 kV 2207 motors. It's one of the best high-end motors you can get in the market. This time I am also using a GPS. It's the HGLRC M100 Pro. It's totally recommended if you don't want to lose your quad after a crash. And for the VTX, I am using the T-Motor FT800. It's definitely better than the SpeedyBeat TX800. It's totally recommended. And for the camera, it's the Caddax Ratel 2 from my previous build. The performance is really good. You should definitely check this out. And for the antenna, it's the Foxier Pagoda. I really love the performance of this antenna. It's totally recommended. To watch the live analog FPV footage, I am using the Skyzone Sky 040 Pro FPV goggles. It's one of the best in the market and it's totally recommended. And for the receiver, it's the Radiomaster ELRS RP1V2. And for transmission, I am using Radiomaster Express LRS micro module with my TX12 Radiomaster controller. I recommend you to get a transmitter with Express LRS protocol supported on it, as this is gonna provide you sufficient range and penetration to start out FPV. As I said earlier, for the frame, it's a dead cat frame, and what that means is the front motor arms are shorter than the rear motor arms, as this provides a floaty movement in the air and you don't see the props while flying. And as you can see, I have already assembled the frame and removed the top plate, as it comes separated and you have to assemble it on your own. It comes with a manual, so you can follow that up. I am also using a XT60 3D print. The STL file is provided in the description. As you can see, I have mounted the XT60 and the capacitor with it. And I have mounted the SMA2 MMCX VTX connector cable. So let's start the build from mounting the ESC, but I am flipping the orientation of the ESC as I have mounted the XT60 connector on the front side of the frame. I am soldering the ESC to the XT60 connector cables and the capacitor, as it's easier to solder before mounting all the motors. Alright, the XT60 solder joints looks pretty clean to me. Now it's time I solder some loose wires to the ESC, as I'm gonna connect it to the flight controller later. The solder joints turned out to be pretty clean, and the reason I am not using the JST connector for the ESC and flight controller is that it's a little short for the orientation I'm gonna use it. Now it's time to install the motors, and I am also using the motor wire shields that comes with the frame itself. And to mount it, I am using these M3 bolts that comes with the motors. While mounting the motors, remember to use suitable length of bolts so you don't accidentally touch the motor windings with the bolts. I have installed all the 4 motors. Now it's time we solder the motor wires with the ESC. If you are a beginner and don't know how to solder properly, I have linked up some tutorials on the description. You can go check them out after this video. It's definitely gonna help you around. The soldering looks pretty clean to me and I'm really satisfied with it. Now it's time I solder loose wires to the receiver. Once the soldering is done, I'm gonna put a heat shrink tube on the receiver and then mount it on the frame. Here you can see how I have mounted the receiver to the frame. It's right below where the VTX is gonna be mounted. And I am installing the receiver's antenna to the 3D printed part that comes with the frame. And to secure it, I am using this M2 bolt. And I am mounting the VTX upside down, as I am gonna use the solder pads instead of the JST connector. And I am using these M2 nuts to secure the VTX. As you can see, I have used some silicone spacers to install the VTX, as I'm gonna route cables underneath it later. On default orientation, the arrow you see on the flight controller is supposed to face towards the front side of the quad, or you can later configure it on any software. I'm using same silicone spacers I used on the VTX, as it's gonna provide me enough space to route cables underneath it. Now to place the flight controller on top of the ESC, as you can see it fits perfectly. I am also installing this connector cable to the VTX. To install all the components to the flight controller, I am going to follow this circuit diagram that comes with the stack. If you are using a different flight controller, you have to follow your own circuit diagram. Now I am going to solder the receiver wires to the flight controller. Off camera, I have also soldered the flight controller with the ESC as it was a little difficult for me to record while soldering. Now I am using this smoke stopper. Generally we use it after finishing the build, but I recommend you to use it throughout the build as this lets you know if you have made any mistakes. And I am installing the GPS to the 3D printed mount. For the GPS, I am using the JST connector plug. Here you can see I have routed it through the 3D print and the VTX and then to the FC. Mounting the analog camera on this frame is a little tricky as this frame supports the DJI O4 Pro. Later I'm gonna show how I mounted the camera to the frame, but for now I'm gonna solder all the components to the flight controller. Alright, the build process is almost finished. I have soldered all the components to the flight controller and I mounted the analog camera to the frame by using some hot glue. It looks a little ugly but it works. Also I have installed the VTX antenna and now I'm gonna use this protector that comes with the frame for the flight controller and secure the flight controller stack with some M3 nuts. Now it's time I install these side protector shields and secure it with some M2 bolts. I have already programmed it, so now it's time I install the top plate. And here is the final product. The build looks pretty clean to me, and for this time I am using iFlight Nazgul 5-inch propeller set. To power this up, I am using CHNL Black 1300 mAh 6S LiPo cell, and for the charger I am using SkyRC B6 Neo. It's a pretty good charger, totally recommend it. Alright guys, now the build process is finished. We can finally go for a test flight and try out our quad. But before going for a test flight, I would like you to invite to my Instagram where I upload more FPV content and short form content. So make sure to follow me on the Instagram, and if you like my content, make sure to subscribe my YouTube channel. So let's go for the flight.